Hi, and welcome to InfoSec Pros. I'm Kane, Field CISO at Hyperproof, and I'm joined today at RSA 2025 by Scott Francis, a Principal Director and Head of Emerging Tech at Accenture. Um, Welcome to the show, Scott.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here.
So, you're from the future, as best as I can tell, right? You're an expert in the future from technologies related to space and post-quantum encrypting. And what inspired you to get into consulting in areas where there's, I guess, not really an immediate horizon to results?
Yep. No, great question. I've always been interested in what's next ever since I was a kid. I mean, I was a sci-fi junkie from the earliest days. My plan was always, to be an astrophysicist. And then after I had a couple of semesters of calculus, I decided I wanted something a little bit easier. But even before I joined Accenture, when I was at Amazon, I spent a lot of time working on just, curating news and discussion about emerging technologies. So when I joined Accenture, I spent most of my time working in AWS security, but I always had a passion for what's next just because it's interesting. And I think some of the most interesting things that we see happen at the intersection of domains. And we see that most often in emerging tech where things are still very fluid and, capability is still under development, risks are not well understood. It's where we have the most surprises, both good and, not so good. And that area where we have surprises that are not so good, that's the security side of things. So I like to think about what's coming next and help people ask the question, well, what if? What if this goes the way you think? What if it doesn't go the way you think? What if regulations change in a certain way? What if it suddenly is 10x cheaper to put something up into orbit than it was 10 years ago? What if these things happen? How can your business be ready? How can you take advantage?
And something I think that prior to starting recording, you and I were talking about was post-quantum encryption. And I know that I keep being told, like, Kane, it's 2018. Post-quantum is 5 years away, which was the same conversation I had in 2013 and the same conversation I had in 2003. It's always been 5 years off. But how would you describe the varying timelines for post-quantum encryption and post-quantum cryptography adoption rates? Yep, because I think that domestically here in the United States, we have keep me honest here, I think it is 2035 when we're all supposed to have PQC, post-quantum computing, in place, versus I think the European markets have I guess you'd say, a more immediate concern.
Yep. No, that's good. So I think there's a few different things to call out here. One is that there's a couple of parallel timelines going on. The discussion up until about August of last year was how long do we have until a viable quantum computer is available that can factor large integers? And that was anywhere from 18 months to 30 years, depending on who you talk to, or maybe never. And there's a lot of, subjective back and forth on that, depending on whose hardware timeline are you following. There's, a whole bunch of different players involved. And then in August of last year, NIST announced formal candidates for new encryption standards. And they've been working on this for 10 years, just like they did with the development of AES, 20 years ago. And as soon as that happened, it triggered a whole bunch of changes in compliance and regulatory frameworks. So PCI, for instance, has some language in there about adopting latest available standards. Well, as soon as these things became formalized, it triggered a bunch of changes for people that have to follow PCI. So what that means is that in 2030, RSA and elliptic curve are both deprecated in the US. They're disallowed completely by 2035. And NIST has another dozen or so standards in the pipeline following along behind the, 3 or 4 or 5 that they've already formalized. So organizations need to be prepared for making these wholesale changes to standards that are already included. And a lot of organizations have done this work before, 10 years ago and 20 years ago. They've, moved from SSL to TLS, they moved from DES to AES, they moved from SHA-1 to SHA-2. But I was talking earlier with one of your colleagues, and I think one of the things that's going to be an unpleasant surprise for a lot of organizations is, even though operationally this looks familiar in terms of what they have to do, I think the scope of what needs to be done is so much bigger because the growth of technology in most organizations has been so huge over the last decade and a half or so that the number of things that are deployed that need to be examined and remediated is an order of magnitude or more than what it was the last time around. So the volume of what needs to happen is bigger. And as an industry, we've been really good at encouraging people to adopt cryptography, to keep things secret, to use it for identity, to make sure that machines identify to each other and that humans identify to machines. We have service roles. Like, we're doing much better at adopting cryptography across the industry, but that means the number of things out there that use crypto that need to be updated is much bigger than what it was.
And you just raised a really good point there. A number of friends of mine who are CISOs in the industrial manufacturing space, as well as in the aviation, avionics space, it's typically in manufacturing. You deploy a piece of equipment and you expect it's got a 30 to 50-year lifetime on that piece of equipment. And they've been adopting IIoT, Industrial Internet of Things devices, which, as you can imagine, do not use post-quantum encryption. And they were built probably by the lowest, cheapest vendor that makes the thing. And then they were white labeled by or black labeled by somebody else. The challenge they're finding is getting even an inventory of all the things they have to update. That's part one. And then the second part, and I think this is the more insidious part, is making a business case to update all of those. Like, if you have 1 million sensors out in the field and you have to send a human to go update every one of those 1 million sensors, and maybe you can do some batching against this abstract theft of post-quantum encryption being quantum breaking encryption. What's the guidance for CISOs who are trying to make that business justification case of security and the requirement to have PQC compliant algorithms versus do nothing?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of different levels of business risk here. The level that people have been thinking about the longest is what we call steal now, decrypt later. So that is, I have some secrets. They need to be kept secret for, let's say, 10 years. If they're exposed to competitors or the public in less than 10 years, it causes, major business harm, lost profit or reputational damage or fines or whatever. And then it's going to take me some number of years to migrate to a more secure system. Let's call it 5 years and be, the opposite of conservative. So that means I've got about a 15-year time horizon. And, how long is it going to take before a quantum computer is widely available that can break this stuff? So that's the first business risk that people have been thinking about for a long time. And there's an equation called Mosca's inequality that Dr. Michele Mosca came up with that kind of codifies this. His paper is like 2 pages long, highly recommended. But there's a newer business risk that especially heavily regulated industries, customers that have to do a lot of attestation and proof about the fact that they're compliant. And that is, well, our regulators now require that we be quantum safe. They require that we adopt these new NIST standards. We have to have an inventory of what we have. We have to have a roadmap for adoption. And in most organizations, the risk there is around compliance. How big is the fine if we're not compliant? Can we still pass PCI? Can we still process user data if we operate in Europe? So there's that compliance specter. And then how long is it going to take me to operate this? Do I even have, like you said, a path forward for systems that maybe are out in the field, are up in orbit where there's no way I can ever get to them? What is my approach? And so one of the ways that we're trying to help customers is think about, well, how can I approach this? Because I think for most orgs, this is going to be less of a technology problem to solve and more of an organizational nut to crack. It's going to be managing the 60 or 70% of what you need to do that is not under your direct control. It's coordinating all your vendors. It's, I can't fix this thing, so can I put in a mitigation that maybe wraps that connection in post-quantum via proxy or something like that? So there's a lot of different vendors that are working in this space, but trying to figure out what is my approach that puts all the puzzle pieces in place? And then how do I wrangle the adoption roadmaps for all of my external vendors and suppliers so that my overall business risk around compliance and data protection is covered?
And something I want to go back to that you said earlier and tie it in is you were talking about, NIST has released algorithmic recommendations. One of them is KLMEM, right?
Yep,
And
yeah.
ML, there you go. See, that's why you're the expert and I'm not. Something I've seen though is there are different implementation plans and schedules from different agencies. And I know some of the companies I'm talking about. How do we manage that from an attestation perspective?
Great
To say that
question.
we are post-quantum compliant,
Yep.
but we're using a different recommended algorithm.
Yes. Now, that's a great question. And it's a complicated question because it also depends on where you operate in the world. So, what we're seeing is that, different governments, for instance, might accept the underlying mathematics of the module lattice based stuff, but they don't want to use the NIST implementation. They want to take the math and build a implementation of their own from first principles. Other places that we're seeing, in particular, we're seeing in Europe, a much higher adoption rate for quantum key distribution, which doesn't use cryptography at all. It uses the physics of quantum mechanics to keep things secret. But there's a lot of trade-offs there around implementation. You can't use it everywhere. It doesn't necessarily run over the internet. You've got, distance limitations. We're also seeing in Germany, for instance, a much higher adoption rate for a crypto system called Macaleese. It's been around since 1978, and it uses a completely different branch of mathematics to keep things safe. It's not based on large integers, but it's also not based on module lattice like most of the new NIST standards are. So I think the answer to that is going to be it depends on where you operate. It depends on who your regulators are. And it depends to a degree on what are your business risks? What's your risk profile? Are you facing state actors? Does your stuff need to be secret for 50 years or 10 years? How ephemeral is it? How much do you rely on certificates and identity? So it begins with a conversation about the nature of your business and the nature of your technology estate and what kinds of external requirements are you facing? Do you have to provide attestation? How frequently does it have to be updated? Is it quarterly? Is it annually? All of these things are inputs that are going to get you to a set of recommendations. But if you don't begin with what is the business outcome that I care about and work backwards to who owns it, what processes are going to support those people, and then finally, what technology is going to enable it, you can end up building something that is technically correct but does not solve for the business outcomes that you need.
And that's probably a very bad outcome for everyone involved. My goodness. Just from a compliance perspective. So there's another practical element too that I want to double click on. You'd mentioned about you have expertise in space. Well, you have expertise related to space. I'm assuming you're not a former astronaut.
I am not an astronaut. No, I am an enthusiast.
Okay, fantastic. So my next question is really about the practical implementation here in space-based, satellite-based communications. And from my perspective as a layperson, I can see that we have adopted satellite-based telemetry collection and battlefield situations where warfighters are making command and control decisions on the ground based on the telemetry they're collecting.
Yep.
Obviously, store and intercept, or intercept, store, and then decrypt later, probably not as meaningful as being able to do direct interception and modification of the data in transit, right? Right. So when you're thinking about space-based systems, what are some of the challenges that they have for adoption of quantum-resistant protocols? So when these do come up in a theater of war, that it's not becoming a new way of using information warfare against your opponent.
So yeah, there's a few different risks there. I mean, the classic one is keeping your stuff secret from the enemy. So, not sending things in plain text. And so for a long time it was okay, yes, we'll use SSL, we'll use TLS, whatever. Another risk is somebody listens in or modifies what you're doing. So, not only do they know, but maybe they're, telling you something that isn't quite exactly true. But then we're also seeing a challenge around, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge that we're seeing. We saw it at the beginning of the Ukraine war, and, we're seeing it with other actors where I don't need to know what you're doing if I can just disrupt your communications. And so post quantum crypto can help with being the latest and greatest around keeping your stuff confidential and keeping it, you know, covering the confidentiality and the integrity of what you're doing, but covering the assurance of what you're doing is less a PQC and frequently more of a quantum key distribution problem. And so we're starting to see the beginnings of new developments around using the physics of quantum mechanics to keep things safe and guaranteed that no one can eavesdrop it between a satellite in orbit and a ground station. So I think there's going to be a variety of different things here, but it was definitely, you're right that steal now, decrypt later, less significant when you're trying to make decisions that, have like a 5 minute or a 15-minute lifespan. But you also need to keep that stuff secret for at least the immediate time frame, but also the fact that you have the knowledge that you have implies things about your intelligence gathering capabilities. And so that stuff needs to be secret for a longer time horizon.
That's a very interesting point that you make there. And I want to tie those two threads together now because we've talked about compliance, we've talked about space, we've talked about some of the challenges associated with deploying new cryptography standards into I think it's a fairly inhospitable environment, is the best way we could describe outer space. So if you're at a private space company right now, how are you balancing these emerging requirements around post-quantum encryption with just basic operational timelines of you have products to ship, you have market orders to fulfill. How do they balance those?
So I think this is part of the reason why NIST and several other agencies have come together to recommend not just what are the new standards that are, for the moment, safe against a quantum computer, but how operationally should we think about deploying these things? Because NIST has another dozen standards in the pipeline right now. So if you went out and implemented everything today that NIST said you should do, in another couple of years, you're going to have to do it all over again. And part of the reason this is such a big effort right now is because the last time people did this, they didn't make any process changes. It was rip and replace. It was recompiling all your code from scratch. And like I said earlier, the scope of what needs to be done now is so much bigger that that approach is not going to work. So NIST and industry are recommending things, an approach called cryptographic agility. And the idea there is abstracting away your cryptography so that it is in a module that you call via an API. And so this is partly a technology change, it's partly a process change. But if you have to make changes right now to swap out crypto, make those changes in such a way that the next time you need to do it, it's a button push. It's a module update. And then it becomes much, much easier to make changes, to stay agile as things change, to do the right thing when it comes, rather than it being risky and expensive and difficult, which encourages you to accept business risks that you could avoid and you end up kicking the can down the road.
So your term of agility there, I find that interesting because we're at RSA, and often we hear about vulnerabilities. We hear research being deployed,
Mm-hmm.
and in a lot of times where organizations have went through change of technologies, there's been this transitional period where new technological-based vulnerabilities show up. They are often dropped to 0 days. They are often used to great advantage. Are there any obvious ones that you can see, or, what are you seeing right now for vulnerabilities as we move into this transitional and potentially very dangerous space where we're moving from classic-based encryption and cryptography to post-quantum and encryption that's resistant to quantum attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think one of the things that's tricky about this is it's not a 0 day. It's an unknown day. We call it Q day, but we don't know when it's going to be. We know that it's coming, so we know that we have time to prepare. That the challenge is how much time do we have to prepare? And depending on, how bullish you are about quantum computing development, maybe that's next year, maybe it's, 2050. So being being prepared for that and thinking about how are we going to approach this, um it's partly that it's partly that risk assessment there, but because it's not a 0 day, it means that we're not scrambling. But in a way, it kind of removes the pressure a little bit. So it encourages people to say, well, kick it down the road a little bit, maybe it's not as big of a risk. And I think that's why the compliance aspect of it is going to be the near-term driver for most organizations, because whether you're a believer or not, whether you're a skeptic or not, RSA is still deprecated in 2030. And so if you have to be compliant, even if a quantum computer never comes to pass, these new standards are already here and adoption is mandated. And so figuring out how am I going to navigate this enormous large-scale technology change, which in a lot of cases is going to be the biggest tech change an organization has ever done because of the number of things they have to touch, it's going to be a lot of work. And people need to start planning for it now. And they need to understand what their risk profile is. And they need to understand, what their, external factors are from a regulatory and compliance standpoint and from a business risk standpoint, so that they understand, how can I get started? And you may not be able to get started by discovering everything in your enterprise. It's too big. But you got to pick a place. It's like any big technology project. Pick a place to get started, try it out where it's low risk, learn your stuff, iterate, roll it out.
I want to ask one last question, and it's on that intersectionality again between post-quantum and regulatory requirements. And I want to look at the European Union. Yep. Because in the NIS2 directive, which, depending on who you talk to, is either going swimmingly or maybe not so much, but they've got cybersecurity requirements in there. And so if you're looking to sell into, let's just constrain this to space, to your area of expertise. If you're looking to sell into the European market, to have to contend with NIS2 regulations, and you're looking at post-quantum encryption and cryptography, what should you be thinking about right now in the near-term horizon if you want to maintain a market presence?
Yep. One of my friends likes to say, she said when she joined Accenture, she went to, the guy that hired both of us is brilliant. And she said, help me make decisions today that I won't regret in 5 years. And so I think part of it is thinking not just what do I need to do today in order to satisfy today's set of requirements, but how can I do it in such a way that it is easier for me to make the necessary changes and to build in some flexibility, so that when I know I'm going to have to make the next set of things, it's a little bit easier to do. I was talking to one customer this morning that is dealing with, they're in the construction space and they've got a lot of equipment out on the field, and somebody made a decision a long time ago to bake in a root of trust that uses SHA-1, and it's been deprecated for more than a decade now, but there's no way for them to change it. And so that's where cryptographic agility comes in, is because there are approaches that you can take that acknowledge the fact that there are components of your estate, whether it's a mainframe or, a piece of equipment out in the field, that you're never going to be able to change or maybe even touch. So what things can I put in my network that sit in the middle of those that perhaps provide some, abstraction layer that wrap things in a proxy that enable me to at least ensure that within the boundaries of that, kind of like a pod of containers in Kubernetes, everything inside of it can talk to itself. But if I have to go out to the outside world, I need a gateway that sits there that ensures that what I'm doing is compliant and safe when I go out into the big bad internet.
And I really love that that's actionable advice. Those are things that architects can hear. I hear words like proxies and APIs and existing technology. Despite you being from the future, I mean, these are all things that I could see organizations effectively adopting today. That is fantastic. Well, with that, Scott, I want to thank you for being on the show. And if you're watching this today and you know somebody who should be on the show, or hey, if you're that person who should be on the show, go ahead and DM me on LinkedIn or just connect with me. With that, again, Scott, I really want to thank you. I learned so much from today's conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. It was great being here.